All right, welcome everyone. We're going to give it another minute or two and let people come in before we get started. Okay, we probably will still have some folks joining us, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Monica McHale-Small, and I am the Director of Education for the Learning Disabilities Association of America. LDA has been educating, advocating, and supporting individuals with learning disabilities since 1963. We offer a lot of different member benefits, and one of them is access to our webinar archives, which will include Dr. Fiorella's webinar in a week or so, but also webinars by many other professionals and researchers in our field, including Dr. Nancy Mather, Dr. Virginia Berninger, Dr. Lauren McGrath, and others. So if you're not a member, please consider becoming one. Today's webinar is being recorded. You will get a link to the recording within 48 business hours after the webinar ends today. We will use the Q&A function for any questions, and we will try to address questions as they come up, especially if they are related to clarifying a point that Dr. Fiorella makes. And then we will use the chat for anyone who has any technical issues. Dr. Fiorella will be sharing her slides, so they will be sent out with the link to the recording. And at this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Catherine Fiorella. She is a professor of school psychology at Temple University. She's a licensed psychologist in Pennsylvania and holds board certification in school psychology from the American Board of Professional Psychology. Dr. Fiorella's area of research specialization is in the area of cognitive and neuropsychological assessment, and she is co-author of one of the truly groundbreaking and influential books in the field of learning disabilities evaluation and identification, The School Neuropsychology, a Practitioner's Handbook. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Fiorella.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Monica, for a very nice introduction. I am going to attempt to share my screen here. Looks like perhaps that worked. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is a process called demands analysis, which is a way of looking at processing and not just scores when we do assessments for learning disabilities. I'm going to go through very, very quickly just because I feel like we want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Just super quickly, the IDEA federal definition of learning disability, just to make sure that we're on the same page. Specific learning disability is defined as a disorder in one or more of the basic learning processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, that may manifest in significant difficulties affecting the ability to listen, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematics. There are 8 categories: oral expression, listening comprehension, written expression, basic reading skills, reading fluency, reading comprehension, math calculation, and math problem solving. There are 3 basic methods of identifying SLD under IDEA in our public schools. The first being severe discrepancy, about which the least said, the better. but this is the original method, which looked at the discrepancy between a child's overall IQ score or cognitive assessment and their overall achievement in any of the 8 areas. It's been pretty well debunked as a good way to identify SLD. The second is response to intervention, which as a methodology is very good at identifying children who need supports, but which is not specific at identifying SLD. The law also allows states to allow other research-based methods. And what we're talking about today is what is usually called the third method or the other research-based method, often called PSW, the pattern of strengths and weaknesses. There are a number of us who have outlined different ways of thinking about the pattern of strengths and weaknesses. But what we have in common is the general concept of what we're looking for, which is that we expect a student has cognitive processing and academic strengths. The student has academic area of weakness or failure. The student has a cognitive processing deficit or disorder. And the cognitive processing deficit or disorder is what is responsible for the, or presumed to be responsible for the academic weakness or failure. You'll see this PSW is in the ours, school neuropsych, Brad Hales and mine, Dawn Flanagan and her colleagues, when we talk about cross-battery assessment, Jack Naglieri's PASS model. We're all looking at the same sort of thing, looking at cognitive processing as a way to identify where the difficulty is in a specific learning disability. The word specific often gets overlooked, but that's where we live and do our research. I'm focusing today primarily on the cognitive assessment and looking at cognitive processing, looking for those areas of difficulty. So let's introduce that a little bit. There are 2 basic approaches to interpreting cognitive test results. One is called nomothetic versus idiographic. What we're talking about there is whether we are using primarily a comparison to norms, nomothetic being comparing the examinee or the student to the normative population, versus idiographic, which is comparing the student or person to themselves. And as you'll see, we're going to focus today on that idiographic interpretation. Another way to say that is are we looking at level or are we looking at pattern? One of the problems with the discrepancy model for identifying SLD is that it focuses only on the overall level of a student's cognitive functioning, whereas we would like to look at the pattern of functioning to see where the strengths and weaknesses are. Another way of thinking about cognitive test results interpretation is achievement versus process. Every task that we use as part of a cognitive assessment or part of any assessment is going to be a mix of the cognitive processing that is involved in completing the task and the actual achievement, the actual content of what you have learned. And the real difference is to take a look at the individual tasks and figure out how much of it is process and how much of it is achievement or learned behavior. Just to sort of give you the basic history, when we talk about the nomothetic approach, we're also talking about John Carroll looking at factor analysis of large numbers of cognitive tasks across large numbers of people. And so this is the the essence of doing a normative evaluation of how someone is doing is to say, across these tasks, the vast majority of people do X, Y, or Z. This is part of what we have used to develop CHC theory, Cattell-Horn-Carroll, because it is focused on this factor analytic model. The way I explain this to my students is that we use the factor analytic model, or CHC theory, to identify what our first level hypothesis is about what a test might be assessing, but it is not necessarily the answer. The person who would be considered the grandmother of the idiographic approach is Dr. Edith Kaplan, and she laid out the process approach to interpreting neuropsychological tests. It is not as common in school practice, but it is in neuropsych practice. And in neuropsych, we have identified executive functions, memory, speed, sensory processing, motor processing, acquired knowledge, and other. And we'll see where there's some parallels, but also some differences from our factor analytic work looking at CHC theory. When we look at processing assessment, a lot of this research came from studying individuals or small groups of people who had suffered brain injuries. And so rather than looking at the typical population and saying, what do most people do? How do most people solve block design? How do most people define words? We look at, in neuropsych, what functions get harmed or stop working properly when there is a brain dysfunction or brain damage, to decide sort of what processes are there. And so when we try to combine them, which is what we try to do here, is that we end up with what I call levels of interpretation. So we are still looking at a person's overall performance when we do a cognitive assessment. We look to our factor analytic work to look at broad abilities and narrow abilities. But then we go beyond that and add the neuropsych, where we look at the actual cognitive processes that are involved in solving a particular task. What we call this is demands analysis. And what we mean by that is that we want to look at what the demands of a given task are. So the person taking the test or completing the task, what are the demands that they are meeting as they do it? There's 3 levels that we look at. We look at the input when we present the task to the person or to the student. What are the input channels? What kind of content is involved? We look at the cognitive processing that is actually involved in doing the task. And then we look at the output. How does the student, how does the person indicate their solution to the task or their findings to the task? And what we look at when we do a demands analysis for a particular student is we look at the task, the test, or the subtest that the student has as strengths and the ones that the student has as weaknesses. We look in depth at the input, processing, and output demands of those tasks, and we look for similarities among the strengths, among the weaknesses, and we look at differences between the strengths and the weaknesses. And this is how we identify the parts of our triangle when we talk about cognitive strengths and cognitive processing weaknesses. Let me give you some examples. When we're looking at input, we're talking about things like what kind of instructions are there? Is it verbal instructions? Is it nonverbal? Is it a demonstration? Is there a model? We look at timing. Is the task speeded? Is the task timed? Is the task perceived by the person to be timed? Is there teaching? Are there teaching items? Is there a demonstration? Are there sample items? We look at whether there's visual stimulus, whether there's an auditory stimulus. And then we look at content, and we're looking specifically at things like how much cultural knowledge is needed, how much English language knowledge is needed, and how much emotional content might there be. When we talk about input in demands analysis, we are primarily talking at looking at these things ahead of time to make sure that we are selecting tests that are fair for the person that we are assessing. So when we look at input, we are making sure that our examinee does not have any sensory disabilities, any differences in cultural background, differences in language development, emotional difficulties that might be triggered by some of the content. We're not necessarily looking at the cognitive processing in the way that neuropsych looks at it. We're looking at it in terms of how are we presenting it to the person? Are we presenting it in a way that will get their optimum response? Similarly, when we look at output, is it an oral response, short or long? Is it fine motor, pointing, fine motor writing, fine motor constructing? Is it gross motor? Is there sensory motor integration? Is there written language? Is there multiple choice? Is there a single right answer? Again, not so much looking at the cognitive processing here, but to make sure that other disabilities don't interfere with our assessment of the ability that we're looking at. You may have heard these called inhibitors or facilitators, or you may have heard construct irrelevant variance. And that's what we're talking about. The things that we look at for input and output is to make sure that we are measuring what we think we are measuring. And what we think we are measuring is your cognitive processing. We don't want that to be derailed by difficulties with the input or the output. So when we do a demands analysis, we look at input and output, but we mostly focus here on processing. When we look at processing, we do look at our CHC abilities. Some CHC broad and narrow abilities are considered processing. Some are considered content. And that's one of the things that we try to look at. And then we look at neuropsychological processing. And some of what we're looking at is left hemisphere versus right hemisphere versus frontal or executive functions. When we talk about, I'm not going to get super neuro-y here, but when we talk about the left hemisphere, what we're talking about is the logical step-by-step, detail-oriented kinds of processing. Most language processing happens in the left hemisphere, but not all. We'll get to that in a moment. The right hemisphere is more divergent thinking. And so it is more open. It is more creative. And so even when we're talking about language, there is right hemisphere involvement in language when we look at things like indirect communication, when we talk about humor, sarcasm, words with double meanings, body language. Those kinds of things are processed in the right hemisphere. So in many folks, we see a difference between language that we would consider left hemisphere, which is knowledge of words and grammatical knowledge, putting words together well into coherent sentences, um, and language from the right hemisphere, which would be something more, can you be metaphorical? Can you be poetic? Can you express yourself in different ways? Can you understand double meanings? Can you understand sarcasm? Those kinds of things. So sometimes when you see those posters in the classroom wall, they're going to have the left hemisphere is going to have letters and words in it and numbers in it, and the right hemisphere is going to have art and music and happiness. What we need to remember is that the difference is in how information is processed, not what that information is. So when we are first learning music, when we're first learning to read music, that's going to be a left hemisphere. When we listen to and enjoy music, when we improvise, that's going to be right hemisphere. The third big piece that we look at is functioning of the frontal lobes, especially prefrontal cortex. We call that executive functioning, or EF. Executive functioning is not a well-defined construct. It's more of an umbrella term. And so it becomes a little difficult as we go through. We'll talk about how difficult executive functioning is to really understand and assess, because it's not really a unitary thing. As I said, neuropsych research really came from originally looking at folks with brain injuries, traumatic brain injuries, stroke, those kinds of things. And what we know is that when the frontal lobes are damaged, a lot of things go awry. We put all those things under the umbrella of executive functions, but there are different kinds of executive functions. So we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Part of what we're talking about when we talk about executive functions is what we call the brain manager. We're talking about handling how the different cognitive processes work together, planning, organizing, figuring out how to store information, how to recall information, those kinds of management tasks, but also more conscious planning. So how do we plan our time? How do we plan to do a task? How do we sequence things in our day? And some of what we are controlling is more low-level emotional stuff. So when we talk about emotion regulation, that's another executive function, but it feels very different than some of the more cognitive planning sorts of executive function. Some folks refer to those as cold and hot executive functions. They seem to be related to the frontal lobes, but they are otherwise very different. I'm going to go through an example. We're looking at the WISC-V block design because I assume that that is going to be familiar to almost everybody on the planet. Whether it be the WISC or the WACE or even parts of the WIPSI. Other tests, you will notice, other cognitive assessments often have some version of this, some kind of visual design analysis and synthesis as part of it. This has been an important part of cognitive assessment since, I don't even remember what year the Coase block design was developed, but it was probably at least 100 years ago. So we think of this as a very important kind of task to assess. So let's take a look at its demands. We're going to start looking at the input for block design. There are models and there are abstract visual pictures. There are lengthy oral directions, so you need strong receptive language. to listen and understand, but there is also demonstration and modeling. There is the perception of it being a timed task, and there is relatively low cultural knowledge and emotional content. Now, keep in mind that we can't remove all cultural knowledge from any task. The fact that an adult is showing you a picture and telling you to reproduce it under timed circumstances by itself is a sort of cultural task. But this doesn't require you to know specific things about US culture, for example. So it's relatively low. When we look at processing, however, this is supposed to be a novel task for most children. We are finding that less and less true as the word gets out that this is part of our assessments. So I can certainly find you plenty of games out there that are similar enough to block design that it may not be novel for every child. One of the things that we look at is whether this is the first time the child has encountered this task. Is this a new evaluation or a reevaluation? Has the student seen this before? We're also going to take note of the beginning items versus later task performance, as there is less novelty to it. But also there are changes. So like when the lines are removed from the picture, or when the design moves from being a square to being in the shape of a diamond. Those interjections of novelty may be places where a student has difficulty because they're having trouble with novelty. There is visual processing involved. Some of it is spatial and global. So looking at the design as a whole and being able to reproduce it. There's also visual processing that is local or directional orientation. So we have all, I think, tested children who have 3 of the 4 blocks exactly right and flip through that 4th block multiple times, spinning it, turning it, flipping it over, trying to figure out how the details, the local details of the orientation of that half and half block should go to match. There's a difference between a kid who has trouble with the global spatial processing of the entire design and a kid who gets the overall design but has difficulty with those small local details. We talk about block design as being an analysis and synthesis task. Which is true. The perceptual analysis is more divergent thought, more right hemisphere thought. The synthesis is more convergent thought, more left hemisphere thought, as we try to solve this problem. We also have planning, strategizing, and monitoring your performance as you match what you are building to the sample. And you'll recognize this as a form of EF. We also have to sustain attention and inhibit impulsive and error responding, another executive function. When we look at the output for block design, we do have a fine motor response as we're arranging the manipulatives, but we also have bimanual work and sensory motor integration. We typically have to work with both hands together and coordinate with our eyes what we are building as we complete block design. And because this is a timed task, especially one that gives bonus credits for working quickly and accurately, we are also assessing processing speed. So as we look at this, we can say, gosh, this might be Let's see. It might be okay to use this in a cross-cultural or linguistically diverse kind of place because we've got models, we've got visual pictures, we've got demonstration, there's low cultural knowledge. It's motor rather than language oriented for the output. So maybe this is something that would be useful across different cultures, but this would be a particularly poor choice for a child with an orthopedic impairment or a cerebral palsy because of the need for coordination and speed. What we want to assess, remember this, what we want to assess is the cognitive processing. And when a child has trouble with this, when an individual has trouble with this, we want to be able to narrow down where the difficulty came from. We don't want the difficulty to be because of the input or the output. We want it to be, whoops, too soon. We want it to be because of the cognitive processing that is involved. Now, can I tell from watching a child complete block design exactly what processing is going on? Just from that one task? Not necessarily. But there's a lot of observations that you can make during testing that will help you. There's a difference between a kid who looks up at the sample, uses their hand to point to the upper left-hand corner, verbalizes to themselves what that block is. The upper left-hand corner is a solid red block, and then places a solid red block. The next block looks like it's half and half. The line goes from the top left to the bottom right, and it's red on the bottom and white on the top, and then places that block, and so forth. There are the other extreme of children who glance at the picture, grab the blocks with two hands, and holistically put it together to match the model without any real individual sequential processing of what they're doing. And so sometimes you can tell where the difficulty is coming from. We've also probably all tested children who put the blocks together and then say, I'm done. No, wait, I'm done. No, wait, I'm done. No, yes, yes, this one's right. Very hard to time those kids, but we have a sense that we're looking at impulsivity and error correction as being the difficulty rather than necessarily visual processing. So when we look at our nomothetic information, when we look at our factor analytic information, we say block design is a measure of GV. It's a measure of visual processing. But you'll notice that when we do a deeper demands analysis, we see a lot more components than just the visual processing that we are interested in. This is one of the reasons that when we talk about what are called nonverbal learning disabilities, there is still some disagreement about what that exactly means. And part of that is because some of our solving of block design is visual, but some of it is fluid reasoning. Some of it is processing speed. Some of it is executive functions. So when a student does poorly on these performance tasks, why did they do poorly? Let's look at another area. Let's look at processing speed. Processing speed is complex to assess. When we think about processing speed, we intend to mean the speed at which people are processing information within their brains. But think about how we assess this. Again, on a Wechsler, something similar to this, where we give the student a code and we ask them using pencil and paper to copy that code. We tell them to do it in order. Start here, move across, don't skip any, right? Because we want it to be sequential. We want to just look at that processing speed. What other cognitive processes are involved in Wechsler coding? We know that we're looking at attention and focus. We know that we are looking at working quickly, whether that is processing speed or not, depends. There is definitely spatial orientation becomes an issue for some children. So there may be some visual processing involved. There's the extent to which the student memorizes the symbols. So there is a memory component as well. So when we say that coding measures processing speed, again, the answer is mostly. Compare that to Jack Naglieri's planned codes. He deliberately designed this so that if you have strong executive functions, if you have strong planning ability, you will do better on this task. Because on this task, instead of being told, start here on the left, go across, don't skip any, you're allowed to complete these in any order you wish. And so we are assuming that children who have good planning ability will look ahead and say, oh, look at all of these A's, let's fill in all of these A's. We've also all had kids who've tried to do that on coding, and we have to correct them, right? So Naglieri is trying to look at the planning aspect. And yet the processing speed, the memory, the motor skills, all of those other things are still there. But on top of that, we're looking at that planning, that executive function piece. Here's another test of processing speed. I'm calling it the Stroop because experimentally that's what we call it, but there's versions of this on a number of different cognitive tests. We show something to the person. The classical Stroop is colors that are printed in a color ink that does not match the word. And we are asking people to name the color of the ink rather than reading the word. For most of us, reading the word is what we call a prepotent response. When you see a word written, your initial inclination is to read the word, not to pay attention to what color it is. Because in real life, it doesn't matter what color it is. What matters is what it says. So we are looking at processing speed, but in a very specific way, where we are inhibiting that prepotent response in order to substitute the slower, more thoughtful response of naming the ink color. So what is GS? Is this cognitive processing speed? Is this a measure of attention and concentration? Is this a measure of strategy use? Is this a measure of motor speed? Is this a measure of compliance? John Willis always says that he thinks one reason Wechsler coding is such a good predictor of school success is because a child that will actually sit down for 2 minutes and complete a completely meaningless task just because an adult told them to do it is a good predictor of doing well in school. Compliance. Let's look at working memory. Do we assess working memory? Sure. But what is actually involved when we assess working memory? This particular model is the Badley and Hitch model of working memory. It is probably not the only way that we can look at or interpret working memory, but it gives you an idea of the complexity of the cognitive processing that is involved in our working memory tasks. So we have originally on the Wechslers, we just gave digit span. We were looking at the phonological store, episodic buffer, and then we said, okay, let's do a little bit of central executive. Let's do some digits backwards, and let's get a little processing in there. We have recently realized, oh shoot, there's other aspects of short-term memory, the visuospatial sketchpad. So let's take a look at visual memory sometimes. Is it still visual sequential memory? Point to these pictures in the same order that I showed them to you? Or is it remembering the whole item as a whole, the design? So design copying. How do we look at, does a student put something into short-term memory and then pull it back out of long-term memory? So again, with newer revisions, the Wechsler is adding some tests that looks at this and says, gosh, let's do some teaching. We're going to give immediate feedback. We're going to take a look at short-term memory, and then we're going to come back and test later to say, hey, did you actually store this in long-term memory or did you not? What about GV, right? We have a number of tests that purport to look at visual processing. And one part of that is looking at sort of pencil and paper copying tasks. And we have what I'm showing you here, the Berry VMI is our most structured test of that sort of visual motor, visual processing, visual motor coordination. And we're really looking at how the child is integrating visual and motor to reproduce the designs. When we move to the Bender Gestalt, we're moving into a more open-ended task. We're not providing one little block for the student to copy the design in. We're giving them the whole sheet of paper. So it lets us also take a look at, guess what, a little more executive functioning. We're going to look at how people arrange stuff on the page. How do they use the space efficiently? How do they plan ahead so that they can copy all of the designs onto the piece of paper? And then we move to the Ray complex figure, which is a more overtly neuropsych measure that we don't use as much in school psych. But it looks at a very complex figure, copying it, then immediate recall, then delayed recall. So we're looking at planning, we're looking at organization, we're looking at visual memory, we're looking at more long-term visual memory as opposed to just GV. We have two different kinds of visual processing in the brain. There will not be a quiz at the end, so you don't need to remember which is the dorsal stream and which is the ventral stream. But you do want to remember that there is a difference between the where and the what. So sometimes we ask students to remember what they saw, and sometimes we ask students to remember where they saw it. Right? So we have tests where we show them pictures, and then we show them pieces of those pictures and ask what they saw. We may show partially obscured pictures and ask them what they're looking at. We're looking at that ventral stream and that what. But we may also show things in place. We may have a grid and we are showing discs in different places on that grid, and then we take it away. And the student needs to match where did they see those dots in the grid, and that's the dorsal stream. And the reason that becomes important is that we can have difficulty in one but not the other. We want to be able to break down that processing to look at the different ways that information is processed to see if there's difficulty in a different place. This is a classic GB, global versus local kind of task, again, used more in neuropsych. And you're only going to see this kind of result in someone with pretty frank brain damage, right? So you're probably not going to see this in your typical kid, but it points out the difference between the different kinds of processing that folks do when they are doing visual processing. So when we present a person with a stimulus that has an overall pattern made up of smaller items, the left brain typically will see the smaller items. The right brain will see the overall global interpretation. In a typically functioning person, those are combined. So if you give me an M made up of little f's and ask me to reproduce it, I will give you back an M made of little f's. But if I have a right brain injury, I may give you a whole lot of f's, but they're not organized correctly. If I have left brain damage, I may give you the M, but not give you the local pieces that make that up. Again, we don't typically see something quite this severe in a school referral, but here's what we do see, global versus local. And you'll notice that the Wechsler has added looking at orientation and configuration breaks as processing scores on the WISC so that we can look at them in a neuropsych kind of way. So here we have a block design that student is supposed to reproduce. Here is a kiddo who has fine global processing. They got the overall idea of the picture, but they missed this detail. That may be an attention issue. That might be left hemisphere having difficulty perceiving those fine details. That might be impulsivity. You're going to have to look at the actual behaviors during testing to straighten that out. This is a kid who did not get the pattern, who did not see even that this is a 3x3 square, but saw that the overall pattern looked like this kind of, I don't know, column shape, and reproduced it, but broke out of the standard configuration. This is somebody who's using their global processing, their right hemisphere, to try to reproduce the design, but not catching what that looks like in as a whole. Let us talk about executive functions for a little bit. We've seen executive components in all of these tasks that I've talked about. GS, GWM, GV, processing speed, working memory, visual processing. There are executive components to most tasks, and it's a question of weighting. When we look at fluid reasoning, when we look at GF, what is GF without executive functions? How would we do that kind of reasoning without executive functioning? And when we look at the model of executive functioning, we say, what actually is the central executive? I think we have sort of this image of a homunculus, right? We've got the brain manager up there in the frontal lobes, making decisions and planning, um, and and deciding who's going to execute what and how we're going to process the information and where we should send it. Um, but we know there's not actually a little homunculus in there. So what exactly is that central executive? How much of that is conscious? How much of that is unconscious? We don't really know. Um, when we evaluate EF, there's two pieces to evaluating executive functions. One is on direct testing. The other is looking at tasks that require executive functioning. Typically, we look at those tasks through rating scales, right? So we're giving either self-report or parent or teacher report. We're asking folks to fill out a brief. We're asking folks to fill out a Brown. We're asking folks to fill out a CEFI, something that looks at those tasks, those everyday tasks that require executive functioning. Um, can the student plan ahead? Can the student control their emotions? Can the student wait in line without impulsively moving out of line or pushing? Can the student control their emotions? Does the student contemplate their actions before they act? Those kinds of, can the student remember more than one instruction at a time? Those sorts of things. So we're looking at that functional level executive functions. When we do cognitive assessment, we're looking at it in regard to the actual task that we are asking them to do. And so the way that we recommend assessing it is to say, take a look at CHC theory to identify what an underlying ability is that is intact, identify a task that requires executive skills over and above that underlying ability, and then contrast the performance. So I'm going to hop back for a moment to my Beery, Bender-Gestalt, and Ray. If I give a Beery, this is almost entirely visual motor processing. There is almost no executive function. I've given you the direction. Here's your picture, you copy it in this box. There's almost no planning that happens. There's never none, but there's almost none. If I give you the Beery and you do okay, then I can move up to a Bender-Gestalt or a Ray and say, I know that you've got the visual motor skills sufficient to copy these designs, but now I want to see how you plan them on the page. I know that you've got the visual motor skills to draw this design, but do you do it in an organized way? Do you plan? And can you recall it? Can you recall it after time, right? If we don't assess the underlying skill first, we don't know if the student's difficulty is because of executive function or because of that other underlying cognitive processing that happens. And this is why, to some extent, that we have difficulty with the rating scales as a measure of executive function in the cognitive sense. We do not know that the child or that the student has the underlying ability to do the task before we start assessing whether it's an executive function failure that they don't do the task, if that makes sense. So if you have a student who can't write easily, who has trouble just with the plain old visual motor part of writing things down, if you say, oh my gosh, there's an executive function problem because so-and-so doesn't write down their homework in their homework notebook, or so-and-so doesn't copy the questions properly from the board. They must not be planning ahead. We don't know that, right? We want to assess both those lower level skills and also those executive skills to see where the difficulty is coming from. How are we doing on time? Okay. I've included 2 other slides, and I'm not going to go through these, but these are just so that when I send you the slides that you will see. One is looking at the executive functions and attention measures on the NEPC-2. The other is looking at the DCAFs, which is the measure of executive functioning. And what I'm doing here is saying, when we do a factor analysis, when we look at the overall CHC abilities, we can identify 1 or 2 cognitive abilities that are involved. So when we look at, let's say, drawing a clock, as an example, there's a visual spatial component to that, and there's a general knowledge component to that, right? You have to be able to tell time. You have to be able to read an analog clock. You have to have the visual spatial processing. You have to have the graphomotor skills to be able to draw it. We use it as a measure of executive function because we're looking at planning. But if someone does poorly on it, is it because they don't know their numbers? They don't know how an analog clock works. They don't have the motor skills. Or is it actually the executive function that is the difficulty? Okay. Similarly, with the DCAFs, let's look at Tower, because that is a test that's used in research a lot. Tower of London, Tower of Hanoi, a lot of towers. We say it's a measure of executive function. It's looking at planning, flexibility, organization, inhibition, but it also depends very heavily on spatial reasoning and spatial memory. So if somebody doesn't have the underlying visualization ability or visual spatial ability to know where to go with the pieces to do Tower, we're not assessing their executive functions. We're just assessing their difficulty with visual processing. And that is what I have got. And we are almost out of time, but I'm open to questions at this point.
There was one question earlier that I missed, and someone wanted clarification. Did you say the left hemisphere is divergent? I thought the right hemisphere is divergent. Could you clarify?
If I said that, I misspoke. Yes, the left hemisphere is convergent and the right hemisphere is divergent. So you're correct.
Not seeing any other questions, but if someone has a question, you can go ahead and put it in the Q&A. And one question in the chat is, will the slides be sent? Yes, the slides will be sent when we send the link to the recording. Oh, okay.
The other thing that I will also send you is I have a demands analysis form that is in a lot more detail than I put up on the slide, just because of visual confusion. And I will send you that as well. And that gives a little more detail about what we look for in each of the areas. When I do a traditional psychoed assessment, when I use this approach, when I need to, right? So I do school placement evals, don't care. Gifted evals, usually don't care. Even intellectual disabilities, don't usually care. LD, yeah, right? To me, this is the crux of learning disabilities identification. We know that there are a couple of high frequency issues in reading disabilities, right? So we know we're going to look at phonological processing. We know we're going to look at working memory, especially auditory working memory for kids who are having trouble reading. If that's not the problem, then I'm going to do this. I'm only going to do this when I really need to figure out what the heck is going on?
There was a question about, can you address cascading analysis?
In the 30 seconds we have left, probably not. Um, yeah, I did not talk about development at all. So I didn't talk about developmental cascades. I didn't talk about a lot of things because we tried to keep this to an hour. But yes, these things build on each other. They develop over time. Difficulties in one area can lead to difficulty in other areas later. There are some of these abilities have threshold effects. So if for instance, if your basic visual processing is intact, it doesn't matter if it's very good for learning basic reading and math. It might mean you're going to be a great architect. But if your visual processing is really poor, that's when we see nonverbal learning disabilities, and those kids sometimes have trouble with reading and math. There's a lot I didn't cover, so yeah.
All right, two more quick questions. What about demand analysis for academic, I guess, academic assessment? And then
Mhm.
someone would like to know where would be the best place to begin learning more about the neuroscience of learning.
Okay, for academics, again, I focused on the cognitive just because that was sort of the question that I was asked, but we can do similar things when we look at academics, and we look at it a little bit sort of automatically when we look at different tests, right? And the example that I often use is the reading comprehension on the WJ versus the reading comprehension on the Wyatt. The Wyatt has the kiddo read an actual passage for real and read the questions and have to answer the questions. And that's much more analogous to what actually happens in the classroom. The reading comprehension on the WJ is a closed procedure, which means you're reading a sentence and just fitting in the one word. And that's affected by things like word finding and your vocabulary knowledge. And there's no real way to compensate for that the way you can with the reading passage. So if a kiddo has trouble on the reading passage, you may have to do some digging to look at, is there a word level difficulty? Is there attentional difficulties? Where does it come from? So it's a very similar process. So School Neuropsychology, while I think it is a wonderful book, is getting a little dated. We're working on the second edition, hoping that will be out soon. But there are a couple of other books that are useful. The Essentials books are quite good. There's an Essentials of Neuropsych Assessment, but there's an Essentials of School Neuropsych Assessment that I think would also be a good place to start.
Okay, well, Kathy, thank you so much for joining us today. This was really informative with lots of positive comments in the chat. And it looks like people would really love to see you present at an LDA conference. So won't be this year, but maybe we can get you in the future.
Maybe next time. Maybe next time. Thank you so much.